Welcome to Focus on HR, your internet video program offering news and information on human resources. I'm your host, Kathleen Koch. In our top story, the payroll tax extension being debated on Capitol Hill may affect employers in ways they never bargained for. When Congress extended the reduction on Social Security payroll taxes into the first 2 months of this year, that seemed like good news for employers. But there's a catch. The IRS told employers to implement the lower rate by January 31st. But if Congress doesn't extend the tax cut, employers will have to change the rate again later this quarter. That's a huge problem, according to Michael O'Toole, Director of Publications and Government Relations for the American Payroll Association. O'Toole says, quote, employers' payroll systems just aren't set up to change tax withholding rates in the same year, let alone the same quarter. O'Toole and others say the costs of changing the withholding rates could far outweigh the savings to employers. What makes the situation even tougher is that Congress could wait until the 11th hour to decide, leaving employers dangling. For more on this issue, see our interview with SHRM's head of government affairs coming up later in the program. The National Labor Relations Board made a lot of news in 2011, and that was without a full complement of board members. Now all 5 board positions are filled thanks to the efforts of President Obama, who slipped in appointments for 3 new board members while the Senate was in recess. The new board members were sworn in January 9th, and at least for now, the board is fully staffed for the first time since June 2010. But some predict the appointments will be challenged. Republicans say the appointments are invalid because they were made when the Senate was not officially in recess. For now, the business of the board goes on. Board Chairman Mark Gaston Pierce said, quote, "We are gratified that the board is now at its full complement and can continue the important work of resolving workplace disputes and protecting employee rights." Most businesses today want to increase innovation, and a new study by the Center for Creative Leadership shows how HR can help. The study identified 3 key factors for innovation. The first is motivation. People who find joy in their work and who are driven to achieve goals are more likely to be perceived by their bosses as being innovative. What's more, employees who feel supported by their bosses are seen as more creative and innovative than their peers. Supervisor support is a key factor in maximizing innovation, according to the study. Bottom line, even the most motivated employees perform better when they are supported from above. Finally, the more negative, irritable, or upset employees feel, the less innovative they're perceived to be. But being overly positive isn't the solution either. Pollyannas weren't considered more creative than negative workers, says Sarah Stawisky, one of the CCL staffers leading the study. The key, she says, is to, quote, find employees who are intrinsically motivated and not overly negative, then make sure they feel supported in their jobs. And those sound like tasks ideally suited to HR professionals. Coming up, we'll have an interview with SHRM's head of government affairs and take a look at the state of diversity from the people who practice it every day. But first, a quick message from our sponsor. At this time of year, many eyes turn to Washington for the president's take on the State of the Union. So we turn our eyes to Mike Aiken, SHRM's VP of Government Affairs, for a look at what HR professionals can expect on the legal and regulatory fronts this year. Mike shares his insights in a special interview with Focus on HR's Patrick Mirza.
Well, thanks for joining us in the studio today, Mike.
Thanks for having me this afternoon, Patrick.
Let's jump right in. So this is an election year. There's a lot of fighting in the houses of Congress and between the different parties. What's likely to get done this year?
Well, I think it's a mistake for folks to think simply because it's an election year, stuff won't get done. I've only been doing this for about 20 years and I'm surprised. Let me give you an example. Immigration reform, for example, often is accomplished in an election year. We think it's going to be a very active public policy year, in particular around workplace issues. For example, one of the things that this Congress and this administration are going to have to turn to very early in January, when they get back next week, is an extension of the payroll tax. As you know, when Congress and the administration finished up their work for the last year, they only provided for a 2-month extension of the payroll tax credit and a 2-month extension of the unemployment insurance benefits. Given some of the political fallout that occurred behind that, I suspect that Congress and the President will agree to a year-long extension.
Are there any other legislative issues that you think are going to be at the forefront?
Sure, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think it's a possibility that Congress could give serious consideration to enhancing the employer verification provisions with regards to immigration reform. But the real action, in addition to what Congress might do, is likely in the regulatory arena. Federal agencies have geared up their enforcement activities. You have more employers under audit, for example, with regards to the employer sanctions programs. Employers are under audit for OFCCP issues. And we've seen a lot of activity, particularly from the National Labor Relations Board, Department of Labor, just to name two, proposing a whole set of new regulations for employers.
Where do you see the regulations occurring that are really going to have the most impact on HR this year?
Most directly, as we saw a continuation from last year, are some of the proposed changes to the collective bargaining process and union recognition at a work site. In addition, one area that will be new for this year is we expect that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission will propose new guidance in the use of background checks in the employment process, most directly with the use of credit and criminal checks, things that employers use quite a bit to try and find the right employee for the right position.
Which employers are most likely going to be affected by those background checks issues?
All employers. When you look at the data that's out there, probably around 80% of our members use criminal checks in the employment process, at least for some portion of their workforce, and around 60% of employers use credit checks for some element of their work site.
So you mentioned the NLRB. There was a little bit of commotion over the way that 3 of the board members were appointed recently. What effect, if any, do you think that's going to have on the way the NLRB functions this year?
Well, globally, those recess appointments that you spoke of two Democrats and 1 Republican, I suspect are going to have reverberations in Congress in terms of the overall confirmation process, and further shows an erosion of the relationship between Congress and the administration. Specifically with regards to the National Labor Relations Board, you now have a full complement of board members, which means the board can continue to issue guidance, decide cases, and initiate investigations or findings against employers with regards to collective bargaining issues. We expect a very robust year from the National Labor Relations Board in those areas.
That's saying a lot, isn't it? Because the board was pretty active last year.
That is saying a lot, but there are still 2 regulations that have not gone into effect that the previous board put forward. One is the so-called quickie election rules, and the other is the poster requirement. Both of those regulations are under some judicial scrutiny, with at least in the regulatory posting requirement under a threat of a lawsuit. We've yet to see what's going to happen with the quickie elections regulation.
Mike, thanks for joining us in the studio today.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Kathleen, back to you.
Thanks, Patrick. For more insider insights on this year's hot issues in employment law, check out SHRM's Employment Law and Legislative Conference, which takes place in early March. For more information, visit shrm.org/focusonhr. A new year is a great time to take stock and evaluate what's working and what can be improved. When it comes to assessing corporate diversity and inclusion efforts, who better to ask than the people who practice it every day? So that's just what we did at SHRM's recent diversity conference.
Here at the SHRM Diversity Conference, we're going to ask attendees what they think about the state of diversity. What's going right in diversity today?
I think what's going right is the direction that diversity is going in, where they're looking at diversity as a strategic imperative and looking at it from a business lens as far as how that's going to impact the bottom line.
People are understanding that in order to move forward in the society, we have to think about an inclusive environment.
Many of us are now reporting into the president as well as human resources, so I think we've got opportunity for growth.
What's not going so well in diversity right now?
I think what's not going so well is there are still many companies that are not remaining relevant with shifting times.
What we're not doing so good is really feeling comfortable discussing the subject and having open dialogue of why it's a business imperative and not a social nicety.
We need to be freed up to measure some of the things we talk about. We talk about diversity being broad, and meaning that we're talking about diversity in all different forms, different types of people, beyond the affirmative action categories, and yet often we're limited to measuring just those categories because of legal constraints.
What do you think the next big development in diversity will be?
I think the next big development will actually be more globally focused, so not so nationalistic.
To the degree it has to look at global standards, it's going to actually increase the value of diversity because many countries around the world don't appreciate the value of diversity. And by having standards that are global, we'll see the development of a really global diversity initiative.
I think the next big development is really certifying people as D&I practitioners, making sure that we have a society for D&I practitioner so that people know what they're doing and they're doing it in a bit of uniformity and not just all over the place.
If you could snap your fingers and change one thing about diversity, what would you change?
The perception. I think that would be the one thing I would change, is that people are perceiving it as a soft skill, as something that we need to do just because it's the right thing to do. And it's an important thing to do for organizations. It's important for organizations to strategically look at it.
The one thing I would change is the mindset that training is the answer to systemic change in an organization. It's not. It's a piece of an important piece of the diversity model, but unfortunately, many companies have gotten stuck on that one piece, thinking that training equals systemic change, and it does not.
And that's our show. For links and more information on select items mentioned in this program, visit us online at shrm.org/focusonhr. I'm Kathleen Koch. Thanks for joining us.